Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ida Jones, and I'm the president of the Bethel Dukes branch of ASALH. We have monthly programs where we discuss the National Black History theme. The 2021 National Black History theme is the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. In October, we have the pleasure of looking at elite African American families. So we have Karen Robert Franklin and John Whittington Franklin to discuss the nature of the Roberts and the Franklin families, and together this power couple. So they will discuss their family and their genealogy and the relevance of how their family businesses, both practicing in industry as well as in academics and library science, really spawned a unique experience for African Americans. Our session is being recorded on this afternoon, so please mute your mic. If you do not want your camera on, please do take your camera off, but we record our sessions and place them on the Bethel Dukes branch YouTube. Also, for those who are not familiar with the association, ASALH was founded in 1915 by Dr. Carter G. Woodson in the very hot summer, actually autumn of 1915, when the film Birth of a Nation was premiered, that really showed derogatory images of African-American men in particular. He sought to use education as a tool to dismantle the misinformation and to correct the myopic history of America. Over the 100 plus years of Woodson's Association for Negro Life and History, in 1976 became African American History Month, and now in the 21st century, African American history celebrated around the world in several other countries. Also throughout America, it spawned various ethnic and minority groups to have Pacific Islander Month, Hispanic Awareness Month, and other communities. So Dr. Woodson has continued to flourish and to seed into the idea of using education and history as a tool to dismantle misinformation and misunderstanding. So we welcome you on today. I will share information about the association in the chat. I want to welcome the branch members of Bethel Dukes and those who are affiliated to other branches throughout the country. I will now turn the presentation over to Ms. LaVonda Broadnax, the secretary of the Bethel Dukes branch, for our formal invitation and introduction of our speakers. LaVonda.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure today to introduce our power couple as our guest presenters. Karen Roberts Franklin is a global executive with experience in business strategy, people management, and organization development, particularly in the technology and professional services sector. After graduation from Boston College, she began working as a sales representative in the Federal Office Systems division of IBM. Following her tenure at IBM, she obtained her MBA from George Washington University. Her corporate career included sales executive positions in Washington, D.C. and New York City at IBM, American Hospital Supply Corporation, and Digital Equipment Corporation, which is now currently Hewlett-Packard. Her last 3 decades were as a realtor in Maryland and Washington, D.C. She has traveled extensively, domestically and internationally. She's an active participant in numerous community, civic, and professional organizations. A native Washingtonian, she is currently researching her family's history in South Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. John W. Franklin, for some 25 years, worked on African American, African, and African diaspora programs at the Smithsonian. His various positions included researcher and French language interpreter for the Bicentennial Folklife Festival, developer of symposium and seminars for the Office of Interdisciplinary Studies, curator for the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, and cultural historian and senior manager in the Office of External Affairs at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He has served on a variety of boards, including the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, the board of the Reginald Lewis Maryland Museum of African American History and Culture, the Board of Governors of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, and the Board of Directors of the West Africa Research Center. After his retirement from the Smithsonian, he established the Franklin Global LLC to continue lectures on cultural issues and consult with cultural and education institutions worldwide. He was recently engaged in preparations in Tulsa, Oklahoma, on facets of the commemoration of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, which his grandfather survived. With his father, John Hope Franklin, he edited My Life and an Heir, the autobiography of Buck Colbert Franklin. Miss Karen Roberts Franklin, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. This first photo, my great-grandfather, Philip Roberts, was born in 1847 and died in 1923, was born at Flint Hill, Virginia. He was my father, James E. Roberts' paternal grandfather and my paternal great-grandfather. Flint Hill is in Rappahannock County, Virginia, 2 miles east of the Shenandoah National Park. My great-grandmother, Elvira Belts, and Philip Roberts moved to Fauquier County, Virginia between 1880 and 1900. The death certificate of Philip Roberts states that his father was James R. Roberts and his mother was Susie Ann Roberts, both from Fauquier County. In the 1879 census of Waterford District, Philip Roberts was listed as an agricultural laborer. My grandfather, James Knox Roberts, was born in 1873 in Hume, Virginia, and died in Mount Pleasant, Pennsylvania in 1948 at the age of 75. My grandmother, Sally Dangerfield, Jane Dangerfield, was born on September 23rd, 1878 in Hume, Virginia, and died in October 1975 in Washington, D.C. at the age of 97. My grandparents moved in 1901 to Hume, Virginia. Shortly after their marriage, they moved to Mount Pleasant, Pennsylvania. My father, James Elwin Roberts, was born on January 27, 1903. My grandparents moved to Pennsylvania for a better life and to live in a non-Jim Crow society. My grandfather was a driver of mule teams in a coal mine in Stanford Shaft, Pennsylvania. My grandmother was a homemaker. There were 3 values that were enforced in their home: cleanliness, honesty, and hard work. Pictured on the football, you will notice the year 1922. This is the Hearst High School football team where my father attended Hearst High School. My father, James Elwin Roberts, was the eldest of 8 children. He is pictured in the upper right corner, and his brother Oliver is in the upper left corner. Their other siblings were Calvin, Ethel, Malvin, we refer to as Uncle Bobby, Russell, Eva, and Henry. My father always believed that he could improve his family's life through obtaining at least an undergraduate education. And he valued education. He sought academic success. He boxed and played football at Hearst High School. He hoped that either academic success or sports would lead him to college. Please note, as I said, the year on the football is 1922. This is the Hearst football team in 1924. My father is on the first row. His brother Oliver is on the second row. You'll notice that they're only three African Americans. I believe that's my Uncle Bobby at the top on the left-hand corner. My father graduated from Hearst High School, Mount Pleasant, Pennsylvania in 1926. My grandfather became ill when my father was in high school. My father had to work in the coal mines. In 1927, he left Mount Pleasant for Washington, D.C. to pursue his education at Howard University. This is my father when he arrives at Howard University. He leaves Mount Pleasant with his brother Oliver to attend Howard University. His family resented the fact that he left his job as foreman in the coal mines to attend college. My father received a football scholarship to attend Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. He made a conscious decision to attend Howard University since he attended primarily white schools in Mount Pleasant. He decided when he was 10 years old that he wanted to become a physician. He realized that he needed to know more about his culture, and he required the nurturing of African Americans while pursuing his education. My father attended undergraduate, graduate, and medical school during the Depression. He majored in biology and studied with Ernest Everett Just. Just's primary legacy is the recognition of the fundamental role of the cell surface in the development of organisms. Dr. Just was born in 1883 and was a native Charlestonian. Dr. Just's fields were biology, zoology, botany, history, and sociology. He encouraged my father to pursue an MS in zoology. My father had been waiting tables at restaurants in DC to pay for his tuition, room, and board. He was able to receive a full scholarship for his master's, which he received in 1933. And then he entered medical school at the fall of 1933 and received his MD in 1937. This is my father when he graduated from medical school, from Howard Medical School. During medical school, you were forbidden from working. Unfortunately, my father had to wait tables to pay for his, as I said, to pay for his tuition, room, and board. While attending medical school, the dean requested a meeting with my father. He expressed disappointment in my father's average performance. My father was unable to tell the dean that he was also working in the evenings. Following medical school, he excelled during postgraduate training because he did not have to work outside of his training. He became a chief resident in OBGYN in 1940-1941. This is my father, again, in his office, his first office. His first office was in the early 1940s, was located at 1209 Q Street Northwest. And his second office is in the early 1960s on W Street Northwest near Old Children's Hospital. In the mid-1960s, he moved to Georgia Avenue across from the old Wonder Bread building. A McDonald's now sits on that land. His first and last office was also on Georgia Avenue, 1 block from Howard University Hospital. My father bought land in the mid-1940s on Kearny Street Northeast near Catholic University, which is now the Brooklands section of DC. He hired an architect and had his home designed and built. His mother, Sally, and his brothers Russell, Horace, Malvin, and Henry Clay followed my father to Washington after my grandfather, James Knox Roberts, died in 1948. The Empire Laundry Diaper Service was formed by my father in 1948. One of my father's patients complained that it was difficult to obtain diaper service from local white businesses. He was able to obtain financing from the Industrial Bank of Washington, an African-American owned bank. The laundry business was located at 4628 Minnesota Avenue Northeast. All four of the Roberts brothers were involved with the Empire Laundry. Empire was doing towel and linen service for schools, hotels, and government agencies. Two of their primary accounts were Howard University and Freedman's Hospital. My mother, Sylvester Authrine Viola Roaches Roberts, was Hattie Viola Williams. She's in the second row in the middle with her grandparents, circa 1900. My maternal grandparents graduated from Benedict College, Columbia, South Carolina, in the early 1900s. I discovered my maternal grandmother's obituary in my grandfather, James A. Roberts' newspaper, The Southern Indicator. My grandmother died when my mother was 11 years old in 1922. My grandfather, James A. Roach, was born in Dazzle, South Carolina, in Sumter County in 1882. He edited and published The Southern Indicator from 1903 to 1925. My mother, Sylvester A. V. Roach, was born on June 30th, 1911 in Columbia, South Carolina. When she was probably about 6 or 7 years old in this photo. She attends schools in Columbia, South Carolina until the 10th grade. Schools ended for the colored in 10th grade in South Carolina. My mother leaves Columbia to attend Cardozo Business School in Washington, D.C. My mother and father both moved to D.C. in 1927. My mother graduated from Cardozo in 1929 and returns to Columbia following graduation. She attends Benedict College and graduates with a BA in English in 1935. My mother returns to work for her aunt and uncle in their store in Arlington, Virginia, following graduation. This is my mother's family in Dazzle, South Carolina. Ellen Reynolds, my great grandmother, my great maternal grandmother, is in the upper left-hand corner. The photo was taken in Dazzle, South Carolina. Ellen Reynolds was born in Lee County to Jake and Livonia Boyd, who are of Native American and Caucasian heritage. Richard H. Roach, my great-grandfather, was born in Sumter County. Richard and Ellen were married during the 1890s. From this union, 10 children were born. My grandfather, shown James A. Roach, shown in the upper right-hand corner, was the eldest of 10 children. He was born in Dazzle, South Carolina. He and his wife, Hattie Viola Williams, had one child, my mother, Sylvester Roach Roberts, which is shown in the lower right-hand corner, holding the huge cabbage. My grandfather's siblings, Daisy and Manita Roach, are seated next to my mother. My mother leaves Arlington, Virginia, and returns to Washington in the mid-1940s. She begins working for the federal government as an executive secretary to a section chief in the Department of Army shortly after World War II. She lives in an apartment at the Howard Manor on Howard University's campus. My parents meet prior to my mother working for the federal government. I located my mother's application for a job in the federal government. My father was among her references. They began dating in the mid to late mid to late 1940s. This is a photo of them dancing around 1953, 1954. They spoke often about the Chi Delta Mu medical fraternity's Christmas dinner dance. My mother particularly enjoyed attending formal dinner dances. My parents married in 1954. These are my parents in Silver Spring, Maryland. 5 years after they married, they moved to Silver Spring, Maryland in April 1959. They moved to the suburbs for a better public school system. When I began first grade in the 1960s at Jackson Road Elementary, my cousin Doreen Hawkins moved from Camden, South Carolina to attend Jackson Road with me. My Aunt Daisy was instrumental in introducing me to Doreen. I spent the entire summer of night I turned 6 years old in Dazzle in Columbia, South Carolina. And I spent that summer getting to know her because my Aunt Daisy wanted to make certain that it was a good fit. Doreen was one of 8 children. My parents did not want me to be the only African American in my school. As I continue to research on the Roberts and Roach families, relatives in Virginia, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., and South Carolina continue to provide me with images and documents. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. My family on my father's side makes its way from Tennessee to Indian Territory. My great-grandfather, David Birney, is born enslaved to a Chickasaw Indian family in Tennessee in 1820. When the United States government passes the United States Congress passes the American Indian Removal Act in 1830, it frees up 25 million acres of land for white farmers. And in this map, you see how the Seminoles come by sea from Florida to New Orleans and then up into Indian Territory. And the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw all come from their respective states and lands that they had occupied during what's called the Trail of Tears. The 5 so-called civilized tribes are all slave-owning tribes and took their 5,000 enslaved members with them on the Trail of Tears. I read recently how the enslaved people cleared the land, loaded all of the cargo onto the various wagons that they would take along the path to Indian Territory. So my great-grandfather, as a teenager, arrives in Indian Territory in Chickasaw Nation, and he's a Black cowboy, a rancher. He has land, a number of spreads of land. And my grandfather, Buck Colbert Franklin, was born into that family, the 7th of 10 children in 1879. My great-grandfather has freed himself, joined the Union Army, and enlisted as David Franklin. And so we've been Franklin since the 1860s. My grandfather is the first to leave Southern Oklahoma and go to prep school in Berwyn in southeastern Oklahoma State, which already exists. So he goes to Roger Williams University in Nashville, where he meets my grandmother to be, Molly Lee Parker from Tennessee. And they study with John Hope, their mentor, for whom they will name their second son. This is the earliest picture we have of my grandfather on the right here. It says circa 1899, and his older brother, Matthew, is to his left. We estimated the time of this photo, and it was the earliest photo we had seen of my father when my father and I edited and published my grandfather's autobiography in 1997. Since then, we were given these 2 images from the Tennessee State Archives of my grandfather. These were taken by a British photographer. The British photographers, the Calvert brothers, who moved to Nashville in the 1870s to paint portraits. and they switched to photography in the 1890s. The photo on the left is of my grandfather in 1899. Each of these photos is dated, and the one on the right, with the gloves and the diamond stick pin and the gold watch and the hat are from 1901. The one on the right is in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in the style section. Grandpa Franklin teaches and farms, and my grandmother married in 1903. They moved to Springer and Ardmore. And in Ardmore, my grandfather, who's fascinated with the law, apprentices with a number of African-American attorneys and studies the law by correspondence with the Sprague School of Law in Detroit. He's admitted to the bar in 1907, December 1907, after having scored the second highest in the oral exam. He's had a rough time as a Black lawyer, as you can imagine, 1907 to 1910. And he decides, for various reasons, to move to an all-Black town of Rentersville. That town is riven by Democratic and Republican split, sound familiar, and by Baptist and Methodist. He's Methodist, though he's gone to Baptist schools, and the city fathers say that they don't trust him because he's a Methodist, so he doesn't do terribly well there. He's holding 3 jobs. He's postmaster, he's teacher, he's farmer. And the lady in the middle of this photograph is a classmate of my grandparents from Roger Williams, Effie Thompson. And her husband, who'd gone to Meharry, suggests to my grandfather in Rentersville, why don't you go to Tulsa? While my grandparents were away in college, petroleum and natural gas were discovered, and all this land that they had been given, the Native and African Americans had been given as worthless land, all of a sudden it's very valuable land because of the petroleum and natural gas it has, in addition to the agricultural riches from crops and livestock. So African Americans move into the 20th century wealthy, prosperous, landed, and with petroleum and natural gas in their backyard, just like Beverly Hillbillies. So my grandfather moves to Tulsa, which is the oil capital of the world, February 20th, 1921. And he associates with I.H. Spears, the attorney on the left, and they establish themselves on Greenwood, the famous street in Tulsa, in the Black section of Tulsa. The Gap band is from Tulsa, and the Gap stands for Greenwood, Archer, and Pine, which are the 3 major streets in Greenwood. Their song, I Dropped a Bomb on You, actually alludes to the Tulsa massacre. Think back, those of you who know the Gap band. So Grandpa moves into this community, leaving his wife and 2 youngest children behind in Rentersville. My grandmother's a teacher. She's to join him at the end of the academic year, in the end of June. But he comes into this community with Black businesses, professional offices, over a dozen churches, hotels, nightclubs, theaters, restaurants, furniture stores, jewelry stores, furriers, oil leasing offices, all this prosperous area that Booker T. Washington visits in 1905 and calls it the Negro Wall Street. And as many incidents occur in 1919 and subsequent years, Black man is accused of attacking a white woman, and all hell breaks loose. You can study the Tulsa massacre at another time. But this is an image of my grandfather and his law partner, Effie Thompson, practicing law in a Red Cross tent on June 6th. The massacre occurs May 31st, June 1st, 1921. And they're already open. They're already open. Hello? They're already open for business. And you see their law books on the floor. There's a telephone between Mr. Spears and Ms. Thompson. And they are processing insurance claims from the businesses and homeowners, none of which are honored by the insurance companies. And they're fighting a city ordinance that has said that they had to rebuild with non-flammable materials. My grandfather successfully fights that all the way to the state Supreme Court. The Black community is totally destroyed, and they are able to rebuild gradually with their own resources. And my grandmother and grandfather are not reunited until 1925. My grandmother comes to this town with her children, And she no longer has to grow the crops that they'll eat, can the food that they'll eat, kill the chickens. They actually are able to go to a grocery store. They have a refrigerator. They have electricity. My father's moved from a village into the big city. In the interim, he and his sister have been in school in Rentersville. When they come to Tulsa, they go to Booker T. Washington High School, and they graduate together in 1930. My father goes on to Fisk, where he meet my mother, Aurelia Elizabeth Whittington. This is my father's older brother, BC Jr., who goes to Fisk ahead of Dad. And when Dad gets there, they call him Little Buck, Little BC. So there they are. My uncle unfortunately dies before I'm born, so I don't get to know him. Here's my father with his two sisters, Anne, who lived in Washington. She was a detective and inspector in the Women's Bureau here in Washington, D.C. until she passed. And my father's sister in the Black, Mozella, taught in the Tulsa public school system. She was a second grade teacher for 30 years. Her husband, Waldo Jones, partnered with my grandfather, and they had a law firm together, and then their son practiced with his father. So with 3 generations of attorneys in Tulsa. This is an example of how we continue to learn about our family. This is my mother's grandfather, Bishop Reverend George Washington Kincaid. And we were giving a presentation for the Pittsburgh branch of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society in May. And the president of that society, who knew Karen's relatives in Pittsburgh, and her mother and Karen's aunt knew each other for 70 years, is the president of the Pittsburgh chapter of ASALH. And so after Karen and I both presented on our families and the knowledge we had up until then, she was so kind to send Karen 4 books of documents about her family on her father's side. And she sent me a booklet on my great-grandfather, my maternal great-grandfather. I'd never seen an image of him. This is from an article in the white paper there's a column called Afro-American Notes. And every week a piece appeared. This is what my benefactor sent me, the entire article. And it is an article endorsing his candidature to be the AME Zion Bishop. The editorial reads that, we need people who are progressive, informed, able, and it gives some of his biography in this promotional piece. It said that he's born in 1855 it says South Carolina, but he's actually born in North Carolina in November of 1855. His job as an enslaved child is to take his owner's children to school and then pick them up in the afternoon, after which they played school. And that's how he learns how to read. It's really remarkable. He's in Tennessee. He gets some more schooling a little later in life, and then he has a calling. It's interesting. My grandfather, my father's side, was told to try to have the calling. He didn't get the calling, but my great-grandfather, my mother's side, clearly heard the call and responded. In the material that what's her name?
Marlene Branson.
Marlene Branson, the president of the ASALH chapter in Pittsburgh, sent me. There are birth certificates, death certificates, census information for him. He dies at 82 after having been married 4 times. I'm still learning about him. It's remarkable how someone who we didn't know well provided this information on my great-grandfather. My cousins have decided to share with me the materials from our mother's cousin and from my cousin's oldest sister, who were the respective historians for their family, to gather all this material so we can join my father and mother's materials in the Duke Library system. Going through my grandmother's papers and photographs, I found this photograph of my maternal grandfather, Samuel Windsor Whittington, who was a railway postal clerk for the United States government. This is his identity card from January 1st, 1937. I had never seen a picture of him this young. And he went between Beaufort, North Carolina, and Goldsboro on the Norfolk Southern and Atlantic Railroad. So you may have things in your house that you need to discover. This was in a box of my grandmother's and I discovered it. And so this is a new image that I'm adding to my discussion. This is my mother on the left, born in 1915, and her only brother, Samuel Windsor Jr., Whittington Jr. They're just so precious. Here's my mother and her sister, my mother Aurelia Elizabeth, and her sister Bertha Desdemona, her younger sister, taken. My mother looks like she's about 10 or 12, I guess, in the picture. My mother meets my father at Fisk. They're graduated from high school in 1931, and they graduated from Fisk in 1935. There's freshman sweethearts, there's sweethearts all the way through. And there's my grandmother again with her daughter and my father at Fisk graduation. Grandmother was always a style setter. Check out those shoes. My mother goes on to library school at Hampton and then gets a further degree later when they moved to Washington from Catholic University. My father goes on to graduate school at Harvard and gets his PhD in 1941. Here he is on the faculty of St. Augustine College in Raleigh, North Carolina. He moves in 43. They moved from Raleigh to Durham, where my mother is the law librarian at North Carolina Central, and my father teaches in the history department. And he writes From Slavery to Freedom. And while he's there teaching 5 courses, and in 1947, From Slavery to Freedom comes out and he moves to Washington. And this is a Scurlock photo taken of my parents. I want to say this is 47 or 48 before I'm on the scene. And my mother becomes the first librarian at Spingarn High School. And here she is in their yearbook with all of her degrees listed. And this is her staff in the lower picture. I end with one of the last photos of my mother with her mother. My mother's mother, Bertha Kincaid Whittington, lived to the age of 102, and she passed away in 1992. My mother lived to the age of 83, and she passed away in 1999. So here you have both families on both sides. We're very fortunate to have this range of images, particularly the earlier images. And we continue to explore and learn our family's history. What a great background they both gave us, both sets of parents gave us, the opportunities and the experiences. With that, we welcome questions.
Thank you so very much, Karen and John, for sharing. I have asked people to put their questions in the chat should they have any questions, but I would like to just begin by thanking you both and ask you how your personal educations went. You talked about where you went to school and what you had done, but that was very unusual for anyone, working class persons, to have educational degrees beyond high school at the turn of the 20th century. So for African Americans in particular to obtain not just a bachelor's degree, but advanced degrees, and that seems to be normal for your parents and possibly their siblings. How did that impact your trajectory towards education and career selection? Did you find that to be any kind of impact in terms of what you thought you would be? Like you said, your father, Karen, was going to be a medical doctor, even though he was working in a coal mine. And that's a magnificent quantum leap. And then your grandfather, John, going into law. So to think about persons who were just literally in the shadows of enslavement and Reconstruction, having these grandiose ideas, how do you feel that impacted your decisions and your sense of community and family?
Well, I wanted to be as a little girl, I wanted to be a physician. I used to go with my father to Freeman's Hospital. I thought that was an idea of a good time to go to the hospital. We generally would go on the weekends, and that's when they had wards. And the nurses, when I would sit at the nurses' station, and they would entertain me. So I always wanted to be a physician. I had a doctor's kit, that was, and a stethoscope, etc. I was pre-med in college, and I intended to go to medical school, but I decided I wanted to. My parents were older. They were old enough to be my grandparents, and I have a younger sister. So I decided I should work first and then save my money to go to medical school, which I did. I worked at IBM. And then unfortunately, my father became ill, and he had cancer and died in 1984. And we had the discussion in the hospital of that he felt that I had a very good business mind and that I should pursue that. He felt that medicine had changed a lot, and he could see the changes coming. He said the pharmaceutical companies were going to control the industry as well as the insurance companies. And he felt that I would be displeased with the medical profession, that I wouldn't be, I wouldn't feel as rewarded as he did, that he had a personal connection with his patients. They could call him at home, to the point of he had to get a separate line because when I became a teenager, I was on the phone too much. And so he had to get a separate line because he didn't have call waiting then. So his patients could get through. He made, he would visit patients at their house. He would accept, back then you accepted cash. I worked in his office from the time I was 12 years old up through college. And, said, I got to know his patients, and it was just very different. And he really felt that I would be happier in business. So I pursued then my MBA in health administration, but it's definitely had an impact on me as far as my interest in health and health disparities and health policies. I was actively involved with caring for both of my parents, as well as John's parents. Being involved. My mother, unfortunately, was a diabetic, and she suffered from she had a heart attack and then had irreversible brain damage. So I returned home from New York, and I was working at Digital Equipment Corporation, which is now Hewlett Packard. Returned home then to care for her until I was able to get professional care.
As you know, my mother was a librarian. Her sister was a librarian. Karen's mother was a librarian, which was a new career for African-American women of their generation. They could, other than domestic work, sort of the first outside of home work was as teachers. And all three of these women chose to go to library school and become librarians. So my earliest memories are of my bookcase next to my bed and my mother reading from the books that were in my bookcase. Both of our parents had extensive libraries in their home. And from middle school on, if the books at school were boring, I could always go and grab something off our shelves, whether it was Baldwin or Du Bois or Margaret Walker, and enrich my studies by something at home. I love that Negro Caravan. I could pull that Negro Caravan out and just read from any part of it. It's just wonderful. So I grew up thinking that after dinner, you cleared the table and you wrote books. Dad wrote books in longhand. And when it was coming up on the Emancipation Proclamation Centennial, I learned the word centennial, emancipation, and proclamation. And of course, Dad published a book for the centennial. I just thought that's what you did. So I grew up traveling across the country as Dad was invited by historically white colleges to teach for the summer. They were looking over a Black professor to see what the interaction would be with white faculty, with white staff, with white students. So I learned to walk at Cornell, talk at Wisconsin. I was at Berkeley when I was 5. We went to Hawaii when I was 6. Only Hawaii offered him a position. And it took 9 hours to fly across the United States and 9 hours to fly from San Francisco to Hawaii. And my father thought it was just too far from any of our relatives. So he didn't consider that position. And we stayed in New York until we lived in England for a year, Cambridge University. And then my father was recruited to come to the University of Chicago. So I grew up in all these different places and had a chance to see other parts of the country. And my parents always gave me an orientation. Okay, we're going such and such a place. This is what's going on there. When we lived in England, my father said, okay, we're gonna go spend Christmas somewhere where they don't celebrate Christmas. And he explained to me the tenets of Islam. We went to Morocco. And so I understand when I hear the call to prayer, what it was. When I'd hear about Ramadan, I knew what that was. We had parallel of our own Holy Land as Christians. So I got all this exposure. And I was always interested in the social sciences. I didn't know what I would go into. But Dad was quite different because he was a public historian before we had the term. I mean, he met Carter G. Woodson in Petersburg in 1937. He attended the association meeting for 70 years straight. I don't think he missed a meeting. Even when we lived in England, he came back for the association's meeting. And particularly in New York, he would be asked to be the guest preacher at churches of all denominations, quiet churches and the loud churches, everything in between. And I would go with him, and someone from the Book and Public Library would come with a little shelf of books on Negro history, Black history, it was called. This is in the 50s and early 60s. And if you want to know more about this, come to the Brooklyn Public Library and you can read more about this information. So when I went off to Stanford, I was already fluent in French. I was interested in racism, comparative racism in Britain, in France. And I studied, at the end of my freshman, I studied with St. Clair Drake. So I went from my household to St. Clair Drake's hands. And St. Clair found me a seminar in Martinique to study with Aimé Césaire and Edouard Glissant on location in French. And so I was just overwhelmed. I said, this is what it's supposed to be. Study the people on location. When I graduated from Stanford, I tried to get into a PhD program in the education department. They told me I was too young. I was 20. They said, go out and prove your commitment to international education. So I said, and the anthropology department told me the study of Africa was over. So I said, well, let me go somewhere where Africa is never out of fashion. So I moved to Dakar. I've been to Senegal, I've been to Ghana, Ivory Coast, Liberia, and Senegal at 19. And then I decided to move to Senegal. I lived in Senegal from the age of 22 to 30. And that's where Bernice Johnson Reagan hired me as an interpreter and staff person and researcher for the Smithsonian. So the Smithsonian found me in Dakar, and Bernice and I traveled to Ghana, Benin, Nigeria, Zaire, and Senegal. I did follow-up research for her. And then I came to the States to work on the Folklife Festival the summer of '76. And I found a new career. I mean, working not in a classroom, but in the public and sharing this knowledge of the Black world with a broad public. So when I came back to go to graduate school, I ran into Bernice in the metro and she said, we need you at the Smithsonian now. And so that led to a job. I started working at the institution in '87, and I worked in various parts of the institution, disciplinary studies, folk life, and then I was one of the first staff people at the African American Museum. So I've used this sharing of knowledge both in an institutional setting and now with our firm, talking to audiences around the world.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. That's very enriching. There's one question in the chat that says, this has been a fascinating presentation on the rich photographic history of your family history, particularly the early years. And the book goes to both of you, can you speak about how this has enhanced your understanding of your family's history? Your family members were fabulous dressers, by the way. So is there any particular ancestor you'd like to kind of call out as this kind of prism through which you see a lot of your own choices and selections refracted through?
Well,
hard to choose one.
It's very, very hard. Because I've been so imbued in the Tulsa Centennial, I have reread my grandfather's autobiography 3 times in the last 2 years. We published it and edited it in '97. And so that's a distant memory. And I'm rereading my father's books as well. But as I know more and more about Oklahoma, and I know more and more about the country at the time period of my grandfather growing up. I mean, I know so much more about 1919. I know so much more about the late 19th century, that situating his narrative of someone born in 1879 until 1960 is a particularly interesting vantage point. In his autobiography, he talks about the issues of the day. He wrote newspaper columns in the Black press. He sued the white press for calling him a nigger in the editorial. A white lawyer brought this to my attention. Says, you know, your grandfather sued the white press? I said, no. He said, he brought me the judge's ruling the next day. It's from 1938. They said, a Chinaman's a chink, a Negro's a nigger, that's the way it is. This is what the judge said in his ruling. And he said, no editorial is going to stop Negro clients from coming to you as an attorney. That's the way it is. So we know so much about the slavery period, and we think we know about the segregation period, but the kinds of things that our grandparents and great-grandparents had to confront on a daily basis are things that are unimaginable to us. My grandfather went into court in Shreveport, Louisiana, before he moves to Reynolds. And he's there to represent a client. And the case is called, and he stands up, and the judge says, why are you standing in my courtroom? He says, I'm here to represent my client. He says, no niggas representing anyone in my courthouse, my courtroom. Sit down or get out. We have rudeness expressed to us, but not like that.
And I guess I would say my grandfather, my mother's father, I've learned more about in the last year. And I didn't get a chance to read. I wanted to read an excerpt from a book, True Stories of Black South Carolina by Damon Fordham. I actually met Damon in Charleston in 2019 at the last in-person ASALH conference. I didn't realize my grandfather was such an activist. It says, talking about the influence of the Black newspaper. During the period of lynching and segregation, it was the Black newspapers that played a major role in keeping up with the morale of the people by giving voice to their frustrations and offering suggestions to solve their problems. South Carolina had a number of such papers, and one was the Columbia, South Carolina Indicator, edited by my grandfather, James A. Roach. Judging by the few surviving copies of his newspaper, Roach fearlessly championed the cause of Black South Carolinians and the fears of heated oppression. On July 21st, 1921, Roach wrote a fiery editorial in his newspaper about W.H. Thomas, a white man from Sumter, South Carolina, who was allegedly caught by local police in the act of assault with intent to ravish a young Black girl. After 21 hours of deliberation, a jury found Thomas not guilty. Roach thundered. In this case, as in all similar cases, if this white brute had been a Black brute, he would have been sentenced to death on the spot. But this brute, being white, and his victim an oppressed and defenseless colored girl, he was declared not guilty. This verdict sustains the Southern preachment that Negroes have no rights that a white man is bound to reject. Respect. At a time when African Americans could have been killed for speaking so bluntly for a white person, These were indeed bold words. But Roach was not the type of discourser who was long on complaint but short on solutions. He urged his readers to use considerable supply of intelligent Black lawyers, goes back to your grandfather, who would plead their cases in a heartfelt and successful manner.
My grandfather also created a newspaper in Reynoldsville, the Reynoldsville Times. So when you go back through these materials, you find things that didn't stand out before that said, oh my God, he started a newspaper as well. So we have grandparents starting newspapers in addition to their other work.
Amazing. That leads into another question. One question that Adrian has about what profession do you think is the most celebrated of your ancestors? And you're talking about medicine and newspapers. Would you choose a particular profession? Because her daughter's looking at going to library school at North Carolina Central. And so she was wondering if you could just talk more about what profession your ancestor had and the resource to learn about what that profession means in terms of its impact in the Black community. If you could choose an ancestor and a profession of a particular ancestor that appeals to you.
Well, I would say my mother as a librarian, because librarians have had a role in our schools, in our public institutions of showing us how to access information. I refer to librarians as the original internet. When my mother was a librarian here in Washington, she had influence on John Kennard. John Kennard was an AME Zion minister here in Washington, then tapped to become the first African-American director of a museum at the Smithsonian, the Anacostia Museum. He's founding director. And John and I were talking one day and he said, your mother was Mrs. Franklin? My mother was his librarian. And before they had the kind of detention that they have now, if you didn't behave well, you'd be sent to the library. So my mother had these young men to counsel in their involuntary library sessions, and John Kennard was one of those people. So you never know how a librarian can have an influence, not just in subject matter, but in a place that where study is supposed to be taken seriously. My mother also was invaluable research assistant, proofreader to my dad. And when he was asked by Alfred Knopf to crank out this From Slavery to Freedom, she said, I can take care of you. You go to DC and find a place to live and work at the Library of Congress and the National Archives until you finish the book. So my father refers to that as the Aurelia Elizabeth Whittington Fellowship that allowed him to complete From Slavery to Freedom on her salary as a law librarian. So librarians have had to introduce all of our children to all the forms of communication. In the olden days, we had record players in the library and language lab in the library. And at the University of Chicago Lab School, in what would have been the 8th grade for me, we were given access to the entire University of Chicago library system and given sort of a scavenger hunt. And we had to go to all of the libraries, the medical libraries, the law libraries, to find specific information. And the only way to get it is to actually go to these different libraries. And then we're expected in high school not only to type all of our papers, but to use the university library system to get whatever information we need. My aunt, my mother's sister, was librarian at the Field Museum, the Natural History Museum in Chicago, when we moved there. And on family night, we would be able to go and pull out all the drawers, and look at the specimen. I never imagined I'd be working in a museum, but that was the first time I had an opportunity, thanks to a librarian, of seeing behind the scenes and the spaces that the public does not get to see in a museum. And so that's a long answer, but I think librarians are keys to all knowledge.
And I would say for me, for both of my parents, I can't imagine becoming an OBGYN when my father did. I just can't imagine. I can't imagine being poor and moving from, a coal mining town and not knowing where he was going to get money from and still pursuing his education and pursuing it during the Depression. So when I think of when things become difficult, I try to remind myself of what both of my parents had to go through. And then my mother living in Columbia, South Carolina, during the period that she lived in the Jim Crow Society. She was very fortunate because her parents were college educated. So they had their own car. So she didn't have to ride on a bus. But just to see the courage, and then to see both of my parents move to Montgomery County, Maryland in 1959. And they were very much both involved in civic organizations. My father became president of Montgomery County American Cancer Society and the state of Maryland American Cancer Society, first African-American president. This is before Dr. LaFalle became the president of the National American Cancer Society. And then my mother also, after she retired from the federal government so she could be home when we returned from school. She did not want us to be in elementary school with all white children and not have anyone to talk to when we came home, or to be with a babysitter. Then she returned to work once we were old enough, she felt, to handle coming home, by ourselves. I mean, maybe was probably 12 years old. And she became a librarian in Montgomery County Public Schools. But she was always very active. She believed in being very active in the community. They both were very active in their church. My father was a deacon at United Church of Christ, Plymouth. He grew up attending that church from Howard University days. My mother was in a League of Women Voters. She was a charter member of the Silver Spring, Maryland chapter of the Lynx in 1972. So they both were, and Jack and Jill, she was a charter member in Montgomery County. So they both were trailblazers. And I just thank them for their courage and perseverance.
My mother also chose to stop working for pay when I was living in a hostile Brooklyn, almost all white neighborhood. She wanted to be there when I came home after they called me whatever, or they tried to fight me. When we moved to Chicago, she resumed library work, but not as a paid person. She became the librarian of the Children's Hospital at the University of Chicago. And she was deeply involved in Illinois and Chicago Child Services. A friend of ours here was complimenting my mother. They were on the board together, and he said how my mother really stood up for the children of Illinois. So it's interesting to hear about your parents through other people's eyes, and they have had an impact on their lives, and they want to share with you how, in the case of your mother or father or my mother or father, how they had an influence on these people's lives. And so that's very rewarding. We continue to hear about the impact that our parents have had on other people.
Well, I can't thank you enough. We've run out of time. There was one brief question from Linda White about the nature of property ownership and the idea of how your families really did not kind of rent or kind of squat. They really sought to kind of establish themselves as full citizens. And I also, Janet Sims Woods, wants to thank you for celebrating African-American librarians and holding them fond to your heart. So are there any closing comments about the nature of land and ownership of land? And then ultimately, what is the end work of your research? Will this be a book? Will this be a website? What do you see as the next incarnation of all of your research besides just continuing learning? But will it go into some kind of terminal or final project?
Well, my great-grandfather, Richard Roach, my mother's side, had over 200 acres of land in Sumter County. And unfortunately, when my Aunt Daisy, that would be my maternal great aunt. When she died, because she died after my maternal grandfather, James Roach, died, there was not a will. And you know what happens then? The family, the land was dispersed in the family, and my mother was the only one. Everyone else sold the land, and the money's gone probably, less than a year. My mother kept the land that she inherited, and she asked me to hold on to that land as well. So I still own the land in Sumter County, South Carolina. So that was quite significant. And then my father decided that in the 40s that he wanted, his own home. So he bought the land in Northeast, and then, as I said, hired an architect and had it designed and built. So they both instilled in me the importance of owning property. And then from there, they both, they moved to Montgomery County, and they had a very difficult time, you can imagine, obtaining financing. They had to end up going to North Carolina Mutual in Durham, North Carolina, because even though my father owned a home in Northeast DC and was an established physician, they would not loan him money to buy property. They had to look at the house at night. They worked with an African-American real estate company, but the broker, whites, would have thought he was white. And so they didn't realize by the time the neighbors found out, it was too late. They tried to buy out the contract, but they couldn't afford to. And then my parents were probably the most educated people in the neighborhood. That's always the way. You move into a neighborhood, just like you were talking about earlier, whites they were blue collar, most of them were blue collar workers.
Didn't attend college.
Didn't attend college, but they were able to get VA loans and FHA loans and buy their homes. And so it was the nerve of the neighbors. They should have been celebrating my parents moving to their neighborhood, as opposed to, and they thought the neighborhood was going to go down. My father grew roses. He had a 70-foot bed of roses in his backyard, and he did not hire anyone to take care of them. And he kept the yard looked like a golf course. That's the home where John and I reside now.
Right now. So I'm gardening the garden that her father designed, the redwood tree he planted in the early 60s. On the third reading of my grandfather's autobiography, I realized that my grandfather had acquired land that he lost in the Depression. He'd gotten a great settlement somewhere in the late 20s. He was able to buy land, hoping, of course, that it would also have petroleum on it. And he lost it all with the Depression. So, of course, he was helping African Americans in Greenwood, trying to maintain their land and fight for their property. My father had the same experience. He was in Brooklyn, chairman of the history department. We finally found a house that white man was willing to sell us, and no bank in New York would lend us the money to buy the house. So my parents didn't go to North Carolina Mutual. My father went to his Jewish insurance agent and said, "You go find the money. You find the money for me to buy this house." So we've had to battle for property. We were both listening to a webinar by Richard Rothstein on the book, The Color of Law, How the US Government Segregated America, on January 6th at 2:00. And our phones started blowing up, and we didn't know what was happening. Our cell phones, home phones, everyone was calling from around the country to make sure we were safe and we're not anywhere near the mall. But we were trying to learn about the history of segregation from this masterful writer, Richard Rothstein, when the mob attacked the Capitol.
And so history is never past, it's always ever present before us and
Right.
around us. I want to thank you both for presenting your family history and sharing with us in great detail, longer than we did it in the National Archives, a very enriched and kind of intertwining family story of American patriots and African-American personalities. So I want to thank our audience for joining us as well. And as we said, we will be putting this video up on our Bethel Dukes YouTube channel. We invite you all back in November on the 21st to join Sam Ford of WJLA TV to talk about his grandmother and his ancestral roots in the Native American community. So Karen and John, thank you so very much. I see the orchids in the back, a tribute to your mother, and surrounding yourself with nature. That might be another aspect, nature and greenery in terms of African Americans and loving the land. So thank you so very much. All the best in your research. And once again, thank you for joining us, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.